in association with Penelope Gibson, who's based in Paris, produced this. And Lynell is a principal in one of the law firms. What's your law firm again? AJ Park. But she's, according to Madam Google again, she's noted as Australasian intellectual property powerhouse with her experience in trademark specialty, expertise in Indigenous law and protecting cultural icons, and has a particular interest in the pharmaceutical companies as well with respect to those particular issues. So she is very, very well heeled in this space in an issue that has really been vexed for our people and, dare I say, many countries around the world. So without further ado, Lynell Tuffrey. Hoodia.
Tēnā koutou katoa, tautoko ana i ngā mihi kua mihia, ki te haukainga, ngā iwi o tēnei rohe, tēnā koutou. Ki ngā mate kua whetūrangitia, moi mai rā. Rātou kua wehe atu ki te pō tātou e tuana ki te ao tēnā tātou. Nā mihi ki te puari o te taumata, nōku te whiwhi ki te mahi i tēnei tau, i roto i wainga nui i a koutou, nō reira kei te mihi ahau ki a koutou. Kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou. Ko waiau he uri ahau no Ngāti Ruanui, ngā ruahine, ngā rauru, engari i whānau mai, i tupu mai ahau ki Porirua, i raro i te koroa o Ngāti Toa rangatira. Ko Lynell Tuffrey huria tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora, so I realise that I'm the last speaker before lunch, so I have to summarise the report. I have to very quickly, hopefully, summarise the report that Dr. Penelope Gibson and I worked on for the taumata, which we were both very privileged to do. So I had hoped to kind of go through, I'm not sure if everybody's had a chance to read the report, so I did want to kind of go through a little bit of a chronology to where we got to and the conclusions in the report to hopefully summarise it and provide you with a bit of context. So if we look at Māori interests and in particular geographical indications, they come from two origins, and this is something that was discussed at quite length in the Y262 report. And if we look at intellectual property rights in particular, to the ground. There we go. Thank you. So if we look at intellectual property rights in particular, they originate from overseas. Most of these rights originate from overseas. They originate from things like the Industrial Revolution, globalization, innovation. Most of our current laws originated from trade agreements, and in particular our membership of the World Trade Organization. They introduced concepts of exclusive ownership, the idea of the public domain, that anything that falls within the public domain is free for anybody to use. And then they create these things called intellectual property rights, which geographical indications are one of. Did that flick? And then if we think about Māori interests and the way in which Māori hold knowledge and their cultural property, knowledge has traditionally always been held collectively for the benefit of the community, underpinned by a number of values, including kaitiakitanga, but also other things like manaakitanga, kotahitanga, and others. And kawa and tikanga play a huge role in regulating how we use that knowledge, when and how we use that knowledge. Our mātauranga Māori is integral to society and how we lived at times. Our reo Māori also has a number of rules and regulations, tikanga and kawa, that apply, which we apply on a day-to-day basis. And unfortunately, there is little protection for all of these Māori interests within our current intellectual property framework. There is some, but very little. And in fact, the values that underpin our knowledge are not protected at all in our current system. And as a consequence of that, we've had this issue arise where we've had a number of, sorry, this is not working very well, misappropriation and misuse of our knowledge. So these are all examples of misuse, misappropriation of our cultural imagery. We see uses of, this was Canterbury using the koru designs on shoes, the tiki, hei tiki appearing on Mattel cars, Bionicle using names like tohunga as the names of their toys, Māori tears as the name of a beer in Belgium, the story to Tanakai and Hinimoa appearing on beer from Auckland. These are carafes that hold alcohol that feature some of our eponymous ancestors like Te Rauparaha, Honeheke, and others. And then, there's current ones like Kapiti cheese using Tutere Moana on cheese. And then there's also misuse of our flora and fauna, manuka honey, people calling manuka honey calling honey from other countries manuka honey, and also our knowledge, etc., being stolen. So how, within the EU Free Trade Agreement, New Zealand is being asked to sign up to a new GI framework, a new geographical indications framework. And so that's another intellectual property right that is going to appear, probably going to appear in our system. And how is that going to impact on Māori interests? What can we try and do to, counter any potential issues that might arise from us signing up to the GI framework? So I was going to talk a little bit about intellectual property, but I think I'll skip that because I'll just accept to mention again that GIs is one of the intellectual property registered rights that are available in New Zealand at the current moment. A lot of the detail on each of these rights is in the report. Okay, so as I mentioned, Māori interests do not traditionally fit within the intellectual property system because they are collective rights versus individual rights, which are recognised in the intellectual property system. Māori interests are enduring, and so that means they last forever. Compare that with most of the intellectual property rights, which last for a set period of time. And then lastly, the intellectual property rights are maintained. I'm sorry, I've flipped it, but I can't seem to flip it back. Maintained even if the rights are not disclosed and are not commercialised. So in intellectual property, once you commercialise some rights, you lose some of those rights, especially copyrights. They start to expire once you start commercialising them. So it's really important to Māori to make sure that any rights they have are enduring and last, even if they are not disclosed or commercialised. So this issue was discussed in the Y262 report, and these next few slides sort of summarise the main points from the report that apply to GIs. So in particular, it is necessary to protect Māori culture and identity because that is how we protect New Zealand culture and identity. New Zealand's law should make room for the relationships between kaitiaki and their taonga works, taonga species and mātauranga Māori to flourish as a matter of national interest. Taonga works and mātauranga Māori should be legally protected in certain circumstances. Taonga-derived works should also receive some protection. The benefits of doing so will be felt not only by kaitiaki but by the country as a whole. And kaitiaki interests in mātauranga Māori and taonga species should be protected. And in relation to GIs, the report talked about GIs and that the current regime that we have is limited to wines and spirits, and so therefore extending that protection to food products in particular would be a step in the right direction, even though those rights still would not protect all of Māori interests in our taonga species, in our taonga works, in our cultural intellectual property. And in relation to our international agreements negotiations, the report, the Y262 report also discussed that point and talks about that the Crown has the right to make foreign policy and represent New Zealand in international affairs, but they also need to ensure that there is active protection of Māori interests when they are undertaking these international negotiations. The degree that is afforded to Māori interests in any particular case cannot be prescribed in advance, and the protection the Crown can offer will also depend on the international circumstances which may constrain what the Crown can achieve. So if we think about at this particular point in time, we're faced with a post-COVID-19 world and what that might look like, and so therefore that may have some influence on what happens with the EU free trade negotiations moving forward. There is a Māori engagement strategy document that NFAT applies during its, it has as part of its mandate, well, I guess part of its guiding policies, I should say, and the report recommended that engagements for strategy be updated to include not only binding but also non-binding instruments, and that engagement with Māori beyond consultation where appropriate, depending on the nature and strength of the Māori interest. And another requirement raised in the Y262 report was that the MFAT should be reporting regularly on all of its international instruments that it's negotiating at any particular point in time. And there's been some improvement in that, I guess, through the Taumata Board, which has been established and which has set up this hui today. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think the one of the key findings that we wanted to get to from our report was how can we use this, how can we use, well, I shouldn't say use, but how can the negotiations ensure that we get better recognition of Māori interests within that GI framework, and then perhaps even moving beyond that into future negotiations. So I've got the, oh sorry, I'm not flicking through my pages. Okay, so one of the main key points that we found in the report was that Māori are traders and exporters, and they have been for such a long time before Europeans arrived here, before any of our whanaunga from Asia arrived here. We were huge traders and exporters, and there's no doubt that the benefits expected from the EU-NZ Free Trade Agreement will also flow to Māori, because Māori are a significant exporter currently. They're also, so they're definitely going to benefit from the lower tariffs in the EU-NZ Free Trade Agreement. In addition, adopting an expanded GI framework in NZ will also benefit New Zealand traders and exporters, and in particular Māori traders and exporters. And that is because of the benefits that will be achieved from the GI framework. The GI framework itself will enable New Zealand to identify those names that have a particular significance to Māori, and a perfect example of that is potentially Mānuka honey is a name that could be protected as a GI and enable us to prevent others from selling honey under the name of Mānuka in Europe and potentially other countries. So there is some benefits there from the GI framework. However, some of the other recommendations we included in our report is that signing the EU-NZ Free Trade Agreement should be subject to a number of issues, and that includes an assurance of ongoing active protection of Māori interests guaranteed under the Treaty of Waitangi, implementation of all the Y262 recommendations and concerns, and the concerns raised during the consultation around the Te Tairawhiti document, ongoing technical and financial support to Māori to engage with the new regime, a full and comprehensive review of our IP system to better reflect Māori interests, increased research and development funding for Māori, a review of science and research, a review of the science and research discipline to better reflect Māori interests, a review of prospecting and access and benefit sharing policy in Aotearoa, a development of a new data protection management regime, and a commission to sort of manage all of that, including carrying out audits of cultural heritage, cultural knowledge, establishing a register of that knowledge, establishing best practice protocols, including access and benefit regimes, adjudicating on any conflicts, reviewing the exception clause in the free trade agreements, implementing recommendations of the strategy for engagement and the Trade for All advisory board. So that's my last, this very quick summary, but I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Any questions from the floor?
Oh, yeah, perhaps Penelope.
Penelope's coming in from Paris, Chris. Now, Penelope Gibson is the other part of the duo I mentioned that produced this wonderful booklet. These are two of the, and I would say this without upselling it, that they're two of the preeminent IP specialists in the world, and we're very, very fortunate to have them in our midst and to doing this for us. And they've raised some very, very important issues. So, kia ora, Penelope. Can you hear?
We can't hear you.
You're muted.
Is that muted?
Is this muted? Are you muted? Sorry. Kia ora, Penelope. We're just winding up here, but just want to acknowledge your participation with in writing this document with Lynell. And so, do you want to make any just final comments from? Are you in Paris?
I'm actually in Bordeaux, in the south of France.
Oh, in the south of France, not too far from Paris. You want to make a comment, Penelope, about just a summary on your thoughts on this booklet and the impacts for our people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
I think also we can pick up on the qualitative mark, because there are certain forms of intellectual property like certification marks, collective marks, and certainly the GIs that can demonstrate the quality of Maori goods. There are ways to protect traditional knowledge, representation of traditional knowledge. And I think what this report, by the end we were quite excited about the potential for collective management of those rights. So there was a lot that really gelled with Maori objectives. And I think also just picking up on the Asian connection, thinking beyond the EU, the impacts of GIs and seeing the same qualitative indicators, China has become the top patentee, and it used to be all the vote to say that, well, you know, Chinese technology, Chinese patents are very low standards, but they're actually passing the novelty criterion internationally, and there is some superb science and technology happening in China. So, there's the opportunity to connect on a collaborative basis and to bring some of that knowledge to New Zealand, to improve, to enhance, to work with derivatives in all sorts of sectors, agricultural from green technologies. And I think that's a very, very exciting opportunity for New Zealand, given the proximity, the regional bias post-COVID, and the standard of your respective technology and research.
Thank you, Penelope. We're going to take some questions right now, but for both of you. So, Dr. Robert Joseph, you got a question? Get the mic to him.
Yeah.
Robert, you need to use that.
Kia ora whanau, kia ora Lynell, we're almost in the middle of lunch, so we'll try and make this real fast.
My question, so what you've said and in the report basically indicating GIs are one of the best ways to protect Māori intellectual property that's currently on the market anyway, but my main question is domestically, what's the best way to protect it, and what's your view on from Ngāti Toa Rangatira, the Kamate Haka Attribution Act and how effective that is?
I wouldn't say intellectual property is the best way to protect traditional knowledge. GIs is I mean, I think intellectual property can help protect aspects of traditional knowledge and aspects of cultural heritage. The GI framework that is being proposed in the EU agreement is better than the one that we have. And so for that perspective, it is better. And perhaps perhaps Penny, you might want to comment on that in a bit more detail. I mean, I think also we talked about in the report is, you know, there's the addition in the EU, and Penny knows this a lot better than I do. There's the different levels of GIs. There's like the TSG, is that the right acronym? There's different levels which provide additional protection, which will definitely also provide better protection for traditional knowledge as well. But to your question of the Haka Kamete Attribution Act, I find that act is a very low. That is probably the lowest level of protection you could probably provide any cultural heritage. It only provides Ngāti Toa Rangatira with the right to be, what it states is that any time somebody uses the haka in a commercial sense, they must identify Te Rauparaha as the author and that he's from Ngāti Toa Rangatira, and that's it. They don't have to pay any money. They don't have to, not that Ngāti Toa wants money, but I'm just making the point there. I think it got misrepresented in the media. Even if Ngāti Toa Rangatira wants to enforce that, they have to go to court. So they have to expend money. They can't get damages if they have to go to court. So it's actually quite a low level, and probably not at the level that we would want. It is up for review now. It is meant to be reviewed, I think it's from April last year. They were supposed to start reviewing the Act. Whether they extend that protection, we'll have to wait and see. So I think that's quite low. I don't think that's very good.
I think Martin Mukaira was going to stand up and do the haka and protest at that low level.
Well, no, he wasn't going to stand up and do the haka. He was about to say that there were various views about this haka. All right? So you're talking about Te Rauparaha.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for my kuia to look after and hit him, all right, there would not be there wouldn't be ka ora.
Kia ora, Martin.
I think Penny was going to say something.
Sorry, Penny, did you want to make a comment?
Sorry, I was just going to add to Lynell's exactly right, and one of the things we point out in the report is that no one form of intellectual property protection is adequate. They are all flawed for various reasons. But I think what was evident was for Maori best interests, then we look at it in the short, medium and long term, and to achieve certain steps in Maori's smart economy, and COVID has again proven that if you can deal with intangibles rather than shipping products per se, then that is of significant benefit to Maori. So you can phase or stage your acceptance of the current system, use it for its best effect in the short term, the medium term, while concurrently it's obviously reviewing the intellectual property system. But the negative effects, Maori unfortunately it's on the back foot in a lot of ways, because there's been a lot of disclosure and a lot of misuse of traditional knowledge, as there has been around the world. I think again in the report we highlight the initiative by the Indian government to catalogue ancient medicines and ancient treatments so that there would be a fair benefit back to the indigenous groups within India. So I think that's probably one of the key points of the report.
Thank you, Penelope, and thank you, Lynell. I think we're going to, one more question over here.
Sorry, guys.
Your mic on? Just so Penelope can hear you.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you for that. Really scary stuff when you come out of wharaponga. Because No. Well, you sit here and you listen to this stuff and you get really scared about it, and ultimately it's a New Zealand conversation and an international conversation, and you look at this iwi stuff and you think from a hapu perspective. Again, it comes back to our capacity and capability to really engage in a meaningful way to protect what is ours, and especially when you're talking about geographical indicators. So how will we be able to really look after ourselves? Really love the inclusion to push for the Y262 recommendations. A little bit worried about increasing research and development funding on Māori-driven research and development, because in a lot of the research money that the government throws around the place, even though it's about Māori, it's not necessarily done by us. It's done by organisations that might have one or two Maoris sitting on a board, but not necessarily the interpretive lens of what it means for me to be a uri of Te Tairawhiti. So, and again, this sort of stuff around here of incorporating Māori values in our tikanga and whatnot into the science and research discipline, along with the promotion and normalisation of such research generally for all students, that is really scary to me, because then we capture and put our mātauranga on a piece of Pākehā paper that then the Pākehā man next to me is far more educated to articulate than I am from Wharepunga. Yeah. So, this, unless you build our capacity and our capability, this is going to be more stress for us in the homelands. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Do you want to make any final very brief comments, Penelope?
Can I say something, please? Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, Rhonda Tibble speaking on a follow-on from my Auntie Ag here. I love the presentation of information by both of our experts. What I see coming out of your korero is that there's a growth area here in terms of a work stream, and that work stream will affect certain workforce outcomes for a certain set of people. So picking up on what Auntie Ag said, so this is a battleground, and it's a battleground to protect our cultural integrity. But it's at multiple layers, just like geospatial information systems. And my question really is now that you've pointed out there's a workforce required, what then is the next step and commitment of future government, because we don't know what's going to happen, we have our assumptions, to maintain that this is actually staffed, but not only that, that there's a regional and also a localised aspect of what this knowledge needs for dissemination downwards. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Lynell and then Penelope and then we'll close.
I guess in terms of building capability and capacity, the report does recommend that government fund the ability for Māori to, develop that capability and capacity to engage with the GI system, because that is critical. That is absolutely critical. So that's definitely in there. In terms of the comments around the science and the Māori-driven research, and I guess perhaps it's not worded appropriately, but I guess the goal is to achieve, a Māori-driven science and research sector, in essence. So it's independent. It's at its core is Māori values. Tikanga kawa is at its core, and so that reflects our science and research and what that should look like, rather than being driven in the manner that you've talked about. And I know that's a big problem in our current science and research. And I know they're trying to do some work in that space, and I'm actually speaking at a science challenge tomorrow about this exact same sort of topic. But they're trying to do some work, but it still needs a lot of work. And I think that was the main impetus. But hopefully I've answered both of your questions.
Penelope,
and Penelope,
you got a comment before we close off?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear all of that, but I think we've been delighted by the response to the report. We have sort of put a very skeletal approach that first of all we ascertain what intellectual assets we're talking about, and from that we can plot a route. But integral to this is empowering Maori and groups of Maori in a collective fashion to protect and manage and open up the rights in initially in the more traditional accepted intellectual property rights that currently exist for the benefit of Maori, and part of the report sort of strays into that strategy that will both inform, enable, empower, and give this quite unique model for Maori to pick up for Maori benefit. There's obviously a lot of work to do. We sort of finished the report, which got quite long, and realised it was just the beginning. But your comments are absolutely spot on. You highlighted some of the key aspects that we know will be some of the most significant moving forward.
Well, Penelope, to you and Lynell, thank you for your fine contribution to our beginning. It's all about the follow-up now and how we actually can translate that to things that happen for our people and to benefit our people. So to you and France Bordeaux, kia kaha. It's wonderful to have you join us. You can't join us for lunch, but we'll have lunch on your behalf. And to Lynell, thank you for your expert. To both of you, for my te pake mo tēnā te tau. And to our group on stage, one more, for my te pake for everyone.
As we move to lunch, just a couple of some comments from me. I'd like to thank as well Manu, you, and Ingrid, and Lynell. You fellas are all for us important leaders of us as Maori people here on the coast, but for us as Maori people across the board. You're all doing some pretty smart, innovative things. You're all working internationally in your own ways, but you're doing it in a way, Manu, I'm looking at you particularly, and Ingrid, you're doing it from home. You're doing it from home, and when I listen to you fellas and you're talking about all of these, complex discussions that you've got in different parts of the world, and fundamentally what you're saying is why you're doing it is you're doing it to create jobs for our whānau at home. The way in which you're doing it is very, very sophisticated. So I applaud each of you for what you guys are doing. And Penny, if you're still listening there at 2:30 in the morning, just so everybody knows, it's we're in these different, we are in this world. We're all working together across different time zones, etc. To bring these sorts of people, I want to really applaud the work that Lynell and Penny have done. It's complex. It is really, really complex. And what I really want to say is the Minister has this piece of work now, as you heard the Minister saying this morning. To Rhonda, your question, I think, which was a great question, it was about, so what's happening next? So already there is some work that's happening. On the Mānuka front, there's a bunch of government funding that has been made available to fight that fight on behalf of all of us as Māori in terms of the naming rights issues. So the government has this document, and I say to Laura, if you're still around, I know your people in terms of the UK, New Zealand negotiations are looking at this document too. So all of the views from our experts like Lynell and Dr. Penny Gibson, this piece of work was described by our 3 peer reviewers. Jackie came from